The day Adaeze lost her baby was the worst day of her life. But what her husband's family did next, that was something else entirely. They didn't hold her. They didn't grieve with her. They packed her things, put them outside the gate, and told her she had 3 hours to leave. 3 hours after 2 years of marriage, after everything she had given that family. And here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. What happened to each and every one of them after they did that to her? It did not happen the way you would expect. Not a single bit of it. If you are new here, this channel tells African stories. Real, raw, and rooted. The kind your grandmother would whisper by firelight. Subscribe now if you have not already, because this one is going to reach into your chest and rearrange something. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Adaeze Okonkwo was not the kind of woman people forgot easily. She was the third daughter of a school teacher from Newi and a seamstress mother who had raised 5 children on discipline, prayers, and pepper soup. She was not loud, she was not flashy, but when she walked into a room, something shifted. A quiet gravity, like the air before rain. People noticed her without being able to explain why. She met Chukwuemeka Nosu at a cousin's wedding in Asaba when she was 26. He was the one standing slightly apart from the crowd, near the drinks table, wearing an agbada that was 2 sizes too big, looking like a man who had borrowed his confidence for the evening. She had laughed at something her friends said, and he had turned, and that was that. They talked for 2 hours without moving from that spot. He was funny in a quiet way, thoughtful in a way that surprised her. He told her he was an engineer, that he had just returned from 3 years working in Port Harcourt, that he wanted to build something of his own one day, a proper company, not just contracts. She told him she was a secondary school biology teacher. He told her that made sense, that she looked like someone who understood how things worked beneath the surface. She thought about that line for weeks afterward. They dated for 14 months. In those 14 months, he visited her family in Newi 4 times. Her mother liked him. Her father said he was a man who listened more than he talked, and that was rare. Her older sister, Ngozi, was the only one who hesitated. Ngozi had met the Nosu family at an introduction visit, Emeka's mother, Mama Nosu, and his 2 sisters, Obiageli and Chinwe, and something about the way they looked at Adaeze had bothered her. They looked at you like they were calculating, like they were adding up numbers. Adaeze laughed it off. That's just how in-laws are in the beginning. They are protective of their son. No, Ngozi said slowly. Protective is different. This was something else. But love has a way of dimming the peripheral vision. You see the person in front of you so clearly that the edges of everything else go soft. Adaeze saw Emeka, his gentleness, his ambition, the way he called her every night before sleep, the way he held her hand when they walked, the way he had once driven 4 hours just to bring her medicine when she had a fever. She said yes. The traditional marriage was held in Newi, the church wedding was in Onitsha. 280 guests. Her mother cried. Her father gave a speech that made the whole tent go quiet. Adaeze wore a white gown with coral beads at her neck and felt, for the first time in her life, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. They moved into a flat in Enugu, close to where Emeka's construction firm had its main office. The plan was to live independently, build their own home, start their family. That was the plan. What Adaeze had not fully understood, what perhaps Emeka himself had not fully understood, was that the Noaso family did not believe in independence. Not really. Not for a son they had invested everything in. Mama Noasu, whose full name was Rosaline Noasu, was a woman of 61 who had survived poverty, a difficult husband, and years of scarcity, and come out the other side believing that she alone understood how the world worked. She had 3 children, Emeka, Obiageli, and Chinwe, and she had decided long ago that she was the axis around which all of them would orbit, not from cruelty, but from a kind of fierce, consuming love that did not know where it ended and control began. Obiageli, the eldest, was 34 and unmarried, which Mama Nosu spoke about constantly, as though it were a wound that needed fresh bandaging every morning. She was sharp-tongued and quick to find fault, but under that was something bruised, something that had been waiting a long time for its turn to matter. She worked in a fabric business in Onitsha and visited the family compound in Awka every other weekend. Chinwe, the youngest, was 23, sweet-natured but deeply shaped by her mother's opinions. She loved Emeka above all her siblings and was suspicious of anyone who got too close to him. She had decided she did not like Adaeze before the wedding, though she could not tell you exactly why. And then there was Uncle Jidiofo, the one Adaeze had not been warned about. Jidiofo was Mama Nosu's younger brother, a man of 55 who had retired early from a government job in Abuja and now spent his days visiting relatives, attending community meetings, and offering unsolicited wisdom on other people's marriages. He was the kind of man who spoke slowly, as though each word were a precious stone he was reluctant to release. People mistook this for depth. Adaeze learned too late that it was something else. The first year of marriage was not easy, but it was manageable. Mama Nosu visited frequently, sometimes without notice, staying for 2 weeks at a time. She rearranged Adaeze's kitchen twice, both times explaining that she was just trying to help. She commented on her cooking with the kind of precise disappointment that was meant to sound like guidance. She referred to Emeka as my son in every sentence, as though reminding the room that her claim on him preceded everything. Adaeze bore it. She was patient by nature and she loved her husband. She told herself this was normal, that every Nigerian woman navigates the architecture of her husband's family, that this was part of the deal, that over time it would settle. And Emeka, what was Emeka doing through all of this? He was a man caught between two gravitational forces, and he had not yet developed the strength to hold his own ground. He saw what was happening. He was not blind, but every time he tried to push back against his mother, there was a phone call, a sigh, a headache, and he would fold like paper. He apologized to Adaeze afterwards, always. He held her and said, "I'll handle it." And sometimes he almost did. But almost is not enough when you are the one bearing the weight. Then Adaeze got pregnant. She found out on a Tuesday morning in November, standing in the bathroom of their Enugu flat with a test in her shaking hands. She stared at those 2 lines for a long time. Then she sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed both hands to her abdomen, and something in her unlocked, something ancient and certain, and she wept with happiness so large she could not contain it. Emeka was at the office when she called. She could hear him smiling through the phone. Adaeze, Adaeze, as though her name were the only word he needed. That evening, he came home with a small bunch of roses, not extravagant, just roses, her favorite. And they sat together at the kitchen table and talked till midnight about names, about the nursery, about the future. For a brief, luminous period, everything felt possible. But when Mama also found out, the nature of everything changed. She arrived in Enugu the following weekend with obiageli and a bag of herbs, roots, and dried leaves she said were for strengthening the pregnancy. She moved into the guest room without being invited. She took over the kitchen. She began telling Adaeze what she could and could not eat, how she should sleep, how she should bathe, what prayers she needed to say and in what order. Adaeze tried to be gracious. She was pregnant and tired, and she did not want conflict to poison what she was trying to protect. But Mama Nuoso was not content with the kitchen. She had opinions about the hospital Adaeze had chosen, about her doctor, whom she called that woman doctor with audible distrust, about how Adaeze wore her hair, about how often she visited her own family in Nyewi, about the friends she had over. One evening, Adaeze overheard Mama Nuoso speaking quietly to Emeka in the corridor. She was not trying to eavesdrop. She had gone to get water and froze when she heard her own name. That girl, Mama Nuoso was saying, does she even know how to carry a pregnancy? Her mother has small hips. You can see it. This family has small hips. I am worried. Emeka murmured something Adaeze could not make out. I am just saying, Mama Nuoso continued, that we should bring in Mama Okeke. She has guided 20 pregnancies in this family. She knows what to do. Adaeze stood in the dark corridor with her glass of water and thought, this woman is talking about my body as though it belongs to her. She did not say this out loud. She went back to bed and lay there and breathed very carefully until the shaking in her chest subsided. At 14 weeks, something went wrong. It started with a dull ache on a Wednesday afternoon, low, insistent, not like anything she had felt before. She called her doctor, who told her to come in. Emeka drove her. In the waiting room, she held his hand and told herself it was nothing, just pressure, just the body adjusting. The mind will tell you whatever it needs to in those moments. The scan was very quiet. The doctor's face was the kind of careful that people learn in medical school, composed, neutral, calibrated to soften the blow without pretending it isn't a blow. She spoke gently. She used medical words and then plain words. She said that the baby's heartbeat had stopped. She said these things happen. She said Adaeze had done nothing wrong. Adaeze heard all of this and understood all of it and felt none of it. She was sitting on a table in a cold room with paper on it, and her husband was holding her hand too tightly, and the room smelled of antiseptic, and she was 14 weeks pregnant, and her baby was gone. The procedure was the following morning. She was in and out of the hospital in less than 8 hours. She came home to the flat, and Mama Nwosu was there. She had been there the whole time. She had cooked. There was food on the stove, jollof rice and egusi soup, as though food could fill what had just been emptied. Obiageli was there too, sitting on the couch with her phone. Chinwe had called twice. Adaeze went to the bedroom and lay down. She could hear them talking in the living room, their voices low, and she pulled the blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling. Later, she did not know how much later, she heard Mama Nwosu's voice change register. It was a specific tone, like a key turning in a lock, that Adaeze had learned to dread. She heard fragments through the door. Blood tests, should have known, family history. And then clearly, unmistakably, this is not the first sign. You know what they said about her mother. Adaeze lay very still. What did they say? That was Obiageli's voice, pitched with interest. Her mother lost 2 before the 3rd. Mama Nwosu quieter now, but not quiet enough. These things run. This girl may never carry a pregnancy to term. My son needs to know what he married into. Adaeze's hands had gone flat against the mattress. Her breathing had become something she had to consciously control. The door opened and Emeka came in. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached for her hand, and she looked at his face and saw something that frightened her. Not unkindness, but a new uncertainty, a crease between his brows that had not been there before. He was quiet. How are you feeling? He asked. I just lost the baby, Emeka. I know. The doctor said, I heard what your mother said. His crease deepened. She's just worried. You said I may never carry a pregnancy. You said I inherited it from my mother. You said your son needs to know what he married. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the door, she could hear Mama Nwosu moving around the kitchen, the clatter of pots. She's upset, Emeka said finally. She wanted this grandchild very much. Something crystallized in Adaeze in that moment, something cold and clear and final. She looked at her husband, this man she loved, this man who drove 4 hours with medicine when she had a fever, and she understood that the version of him she had fallen in love with was real, but it existed inside a cage, and he had never once tried to break the bars. She said nothing. She turned away from the wall and let the silence speak for both of them. The next morning was when it happened. She woke to the sound of voices and found the flat fuller than it should have been. Uncle Gideofor had arrived at some point in the night. She did not know how or why, but he was there, sitting in the living room with Mama Nwosu and Obiageli, with a cup of tea, looking like a man who had been summoned for a specific purpose. Emeka was not in the bedroom. She found him in the kitchen, standing with his back to her, staring out the window. Emeka? He turned. His eyes were swollen. He had been crying, or perhaps he had not slept. She could not tell. There's something we need to talk about, he said. Okay. He couldn't look at her directly. He kept glancing at the door as though he were waiting for a stage cue. My mother and Uncle Gideofor, they feel that, given what happened, Emeka, say what you are saying. He finally looked at her. They want you to go back to your family for a while. Just for a while, they said, while we figure things out. She stood very still. Figure what out? Whether this was... He stopped. Whether this was what? Whether you can... He pressed his eyes shut. My mother is saying that until we know, until there are proper consultations and tests, she doesn't think it's right for you to stay here. Adaeze took one breath, then another. The kitchen was very bright and very cold. Outside the window, she could hear a motorcycle somewhere in the street and the sound of children. "Are you asking me to leave my home?" she said slowly, "the day after I lost our baby?" They're not saying it like that. Are you asking me to leave?" His silence was the answer. She walked out of the kitchen and into the bedroom and opened the wardrobe and began to take out her clothes. Her hands did not shake. That surprised her. She folded each thing with care because the body sometimes needs small, precise tasks to survive large, impossible moments. When she came out with her bag, Mama Nwosu was standing in the corridor. She was not smiling, but she was not pretending either. Her face held the expression of a woman who believed she was doing something necessary. "It's not permanent," Mama Nwosu said. "When everything is settled." "Do not speak to me," Adaeze said. Not loud, not dramatic, just a line drawn, clear as a cut. She picked up her bag. She walked past Uncle Judeofo without looking at him, past Obi Ageli, who had the grace at least to look at the floor, past the kitchen where she had cooked 1,000 meals, past the door of the room where she had once held a positive pregnancy test in shaking, joyful hands. Emeka walked her to the gate. She did not know why she let him. Perhaps she was hoping, still, even then, that something would rise in him, that he would reach for her arm and say stop, that he would remember who he was supposed to be. He did not. He stood at the gate with his hands in his pockets and said, "I'm sorry, Adaeze." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married. This man she had chosen with her whole heart. "I know you are," she said. "But being sorry and doing nothing are the same thing." She walked to the road and called her older sister Ngozi, who arrived within an hour and did not say, "I told you so," which was the greatest act of love Adaeze had ever received. Now here is where the story changes shape. Because you might be thinking you know what comes next. You might be thinking Adaeze rebuilt herself. Time passes. Justice arrives in some neat and satisfying form. But this story, like all true stories, does not move in straight lines. Before we get there, if you have made it this far and you are feeling this story in your bones, subscribe. This channel exists for people who feel things deeply. We are going to need you here for what comes next. Adaeze went back to Nnewi. She stayed in her parents' house for 3 months. Her mother asked no questions for the first 2 weeks, just cooked, just kept the house warm, just made sure there was always something on the table and someone nearby. Her father visited her room every evening and sat in the chair by the window and either talked or did not talk, depending on what she seemed to need. He had the rare gift of understanding that presence does not always require words. During that time, Adaeze grieved. Not only the pregnancy. The baby was a grief she would carry for the rest of her life, quiet and permanent as a stone in the pocket. But she also grieved the marriage she had believed she had. She grieved the version of Emeka she had loved, the man by the drinks table in the borrowed abada, the man who drove 4 hours in the dark. She grieved the future she had been building room by room inside her mind. She let herself grieve all of it. She did not rush it or perform bravery. And then, very slowly, she began to think. She had been a biology teacher for 4 years before she got married. She still had her teaching certificate, she had a degree, she had her mind. She called the school in Nnewi where she had done her first posting and asked if there were openings. There were not, but the principal, a woman named Mrs. Odozike, told her about a private school in Awka that was looking for a senior secondary biology teacher, and she wrote down the number. She applied. She was called for interview. She wore the black dress she had bought for her first interview at 22, which still fit, because she had not changed the way she moved through the world, only the things she was carrying. She got the job. She found a one-room apartment near the school that was small but had a window that faced east, so she woke every morning to light. She bought a second-hand mattress and a small cooker and a wooden table that someone had painted yellow at some point badly. And she lived in that yellow table apartment, and she taught and she breathed and she reconstructed herself with the same quiet care she had given everything she loved. Meanwhile, and this is the part you have been waiting for, things began to happen in the Noso household. Not all at once, not in the dramatic, cinematic way that stories sometimes promise, but steadily, with the particular weight of consequence. The first thing was the business. Emeka's construction firm was moderately successful, not exceptional, but stable. He had 3 employees, a few consistent contracts, and a growing reputation in Enugu for reliable work. After Adaeze left, the contracts began to dry up in a way that was hard to explain. Not immediately, but 3 months after she left, one of his biggest clients, a developer from Lagos who had been planning to give him a housing project in Enugu, called to say the deal was on hold. 2 months after that, another client, a secondary school that had hired him to build a new block of classrooms, terminated the contract midway, citing changes in management. He told himself it was the market. He told himself these things happened. But there was a feeling in the pit of his stomach that had been there since the morning he stood at the gate with his hands in his pockets and watched his wife walk away. A feeling like something important had been switched off, like a current withdrawn from a house that still had all its walls standing. He called Adaeze twice in those months. She picked up. She was polite. She was not cold. She was something more difficult than cold. She was clear. She told him she was okay. She told him she was walking. She told him she did not know what she wanted. He did not know what to do with her clarity. It unsettled him more than anger would have. The second thing was Mama Nwosu's health. Rosaline Nwosu had been managing high blood pressure for 7 years. Her doctor had repeatedly told her, reduce salt, reduce stress, take the medication consistently, do not skip. She had been managing it adequately, not perfectly, but adequately. But in the months after Adaeze left, something shifted in Mama Nwosu. She could not have named it herself. She told Obiageli she felt unsettled. She told Chinwe she was having trouble sleeping. She increased the pepper in her food. She had always loved pepper, and stopped the blood pressure medication because a woman in her church had told her that a particular herbal tea was better.
In April, Rosaline Nwosu collapsed in her kitchen in Awaka. She was taken to the hospital. She survived, but the stroke left her left side weakened. Her arm, her leg, the left corner of her mouth drooping slightly when she was tired. She was in hospital for 3 weeks and in rehabilitation for 2 months after that. Emeka flew back and forth between Enugu and Awaka. Obiageli, who had been so quick to be present when Adaeze was being pushed out, now found the presence of her mother's daily care difficult to maintain alongside her fabric business. She came on weekends. She helped when she could. But daily care, bathing, medicine, physiotherapy exercises, that fell primarily to Emeka and a hired nurse. Chinwe, still in school in Lagos, could not come regularly. She called every day. She felt guilty about this. The guilt cuddled into irritability, which she expressed in ways she would later regret. The third thing was Uncle Jideofor. Uncle Jideofor, the man who had arrived in the night, who had sat with his tea and his slow, careful words, who had been the quiet engine behind the decision to push Adaeze out, Uncle Jideofor had a secret. The secret was not discovered by Adaeze, it was discovered by his own wife. His wife, Mama Jideofor, a small, sharp woman named Ifeoma, who had quietly endured 30 years of her husband's nonsense, had long suspected that her husband's frequent family consultations and community trips were not always what they claimed to be. She had kept this suspicion small and private and buried, the way women of a certain generation are taught to bury certain knowledges. But in June, one of her husband's cousins let something slip during a family function. Something small, a reference that was meant to be a joke, about a woman in Abuja, about a second household, and Ifeoma, who was 63 years old and had given the best decades of her life to this man, decided she was done burying things. She called her brother, she called her children, she hired a lawyer who was the daughter of her friend and who was 29 years old, had natural hair and was afraid of absolutely nothing. The investigation into Uncle Jideofor's finances, which his lawyer tried desperately to prevent and failed, revealed not only the second household but a pattern of embezzlement from a cooperative society he had managed for 15 years. 23 families had been defrauded. The amount was significant. Uncle Jideofor, who had sat in that living room with his tea and his wisdom, was facing criminal charges by September. And Obiageli, sharp-tongued, calculating Obiageli, who had watched Adaeze's grief with a face carefully arranged into something that was not quite sympathy, Obiageli's story was perhaps the most complicated of all. She had been in a relationship for 2 years with a man from Onitsha named Kelechi, a relationship she had kept private from her mother because she suspected Mama Noosu would object to something about him, his tribe, his family background, some detail she had decided in advance was wrong. She had been performing a version of herself for so long, the dutiful, unmarried daughter, the one who could be called on, that she had forgotten she was performing. The month after Mama Noosu's stroke, Kelechi came to Obiageli and told her that he could not wait any longer. He wanted to formalize things. He wanted to meet her family. He wanted a life with her. And Obiageli, sitting in the wreckage of everything that had seemed so solid, her mother weakened, her uncle exposed, her brother's marriage destroyed, sat with herself for the first time in a very long time and asked, "What have I actually been building?" She thought about Adaeze. She did not want to, but she thought about it. The morning Adaeze had walked out of the gate, the way she had said, "Do not speak to me," with such devastating quietness, the way she had looked at Emeka at the gate, not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear sorrow that Obiageli could not get out of her mind. She had been present in that house. She had said nothing. She had been part of what was done. She called Kelechi and told him to come. She introduced him to her mother in the hospital, and Mama Noosu, who was softer now in ways that the stroke had made unavoidable, looked at this man sitting by her bed and was quiet for a long time. Then she took his hand. That was all. 8 months after Adaeze had walked out of the gate in Eluku, Emeka drove to Nnewi. He did not call ahead. This was either brave or stupid, and he knew it. He parked outside the school where she worked. He had found out she was teaching again from a mutual friend and waited. He felt, sitting in that car, like a man who had waited too long to say something urgent and now was not sure if the urgency still counted. She came out of the gate at 4 in the afternoon with a folder of papers under her arm and 2 younger colleagues talking beside her. She looked different. Not changed, but more present, more settled in herself, as though something that had been slightly misaligned had been corrected. She saw him before he got out of the car. She stopped. She looked at him with that clear gaze he had always found so difficult to hold. Then she said something to her colleagues and walked towards him. "Emeka, Adaeze." They stood on the side of the road in the late afternoon light with traffic moving behind him and dust in the air and 8 months of consequence between them. "How is your mother?" "Better. Slowly. She's doing the physiotherapy." "Good." A silence. He had rehearsed things on the drive. None of them worked now that she was standing in front of him. "I am sorry. Not the same sorry I said at the gate. I need you to understand that I know what I did. Not just what happened, what I did. I chose wrong. I chose to let them decide something that wasn't theirs to decide, and I stood there and let you walk away. And I have thought about nothing else since then." She looked at him for a long time. "I know you are sorry," she said. "I believe you. But Emeka, what has changed? What has actually changed? Not in circumstances, not because your uncle is in trouble or your mother had a stroke. What changed in you?" This was the question he had been terrified of, because a smaller man would have pointed to the circumstances. He knew that. He had been tempted. "I went back to that morning in my head for months. I kept trying to find the moment, the one moment where I should have turned. You were in that room in pain. You had just lost our child, and my mother was speaking about you through the door, and I stood in the corridor and I said nothing. I didn't even tell her to stop. I just stood there. And the reason I stood there, it wasn't fear of her exactly. It was that I had never in my life decided that my own judgment was worth more than hers. I had never once put my foot down and held it there. And you paid for that. You paid for a thing I was supposed to have dealt with before I ever asked you to be my wife. The folder was still under her arm. A motorbike went past.
I'm not asking you to come back right now, he said. I'm not asking anything. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did. And I needed you to see me standing here saying it. Not on a phone, not through someone else. Here. She was quiet for a long moment. Your mother, she said finally. Does she know you are here? He nodded slowly. I told her I was coming. She didn't tell me not to. Something moved across Adaeze's face. She looked away, at the road, at something only she could see. I need more time, she said. That is not a no. But I need you to understand what more time means. It means I am going to keep living my life. I am going to keep working. I am going to keep being exactly who I have become in the past 8 months. If that is the woman you are coming back for, not the one you left at the gate, but this one, then more time is possible. He exhaled. Something he had been holding for 8 months released. That is the woman, he said. She looked at him one more time, then she adjusted the folder under her arm. Drive carefully going back, she said, and she walked toward where her colleagues were waiting. This is the part they do not always tell in folk tales, not the ending itself, but the texture of it. Because Adaeze and Emeka did not reconcile quickly, it took another 5 months of careful, deliberate rebuilding, phone calls that were honest instead of careful, visits to a counselor in Enugu who had a quiet office and a box of tissues, and the wisdom not to take sides. One very difficult conversation between Adaeze and Mama Nwosu that no one except the two of them was present for, in a room where Mama Nwosu was sitting with a walking stick and her left arm still not fully herself. What was said in that room is not something that can be reported. What came out of it was not forgiveness exactly, not yet, not completely, but something more foundational than forgiveness, acknowledgement. Mama Nwosu, diminished but not broken, looked at this woman her son had chosen and perhaps for the first time looked at her as a person rather than a variable in a calculation. And Adaeze, who had every reason to hold nothing but the wound, chose instead to see an old woman who had been afraid, who had expressed that fear as cruelty without fully understanding that it was cruelty. That is not a small thing. It is perhaps one of the largest things a human being can do. They remarried. Not officially, they were still legally married, but they held a renewal in Inewi the following January. Small, family only, at Adaeze's parents' house. Adaeze's father gave the same quiet smile he had given at the first wedding and said nothing because he had already said the important things. Emeka's business recovered slowly. The housing project came back. The Lagos developer called again, said circumstances had changed, and this time Emeka negotiated his own terms rather than simply accepting what was offered. His mother, watching from her chair, said nothing. That too was a kind of change. Obiageli married Kelechi the following year. Mama Nwosu attended the wedding in a wheelchair, wearing her best lace, and she laughed twice, a real laugh, unguarded, which her children had not heard in some time. Chinwe finished school and got a job in Lagos and called her mother every Sunday. She was working on her own understanding of the things she had absorbed growing up, the calculations, the suspicions, the fears dressed as protections. She was young enough that the working on was possible. She was trying. Uncle Gidiofor's case was resolved through the courts over the course of 2 years. He was not imprisoned, his lawyer was better than the evidence against him in certain particulars, but he was required to repay the cooperative society, and the repayment consumed most of what he had. He moved in with one of his sons. He was quieter than before. Whether this was remorse or simply reduced circumstances, only he knew. Ifelma, his wife, went to live with her daughter in Port Harcourt.
She learned to bake small cakes on the weekends. She sounded, when you spoke to her on the phone, like a woman who had set something very heavy down and could finally feel the lightness in her own hands. And Adaeze. In the second year of their rebuilding, she became pregnant again. She did not tell anyone for the first 12 weeks, not even Emeka. She told him at 8 weeks, and together they did not speak it widely, did not let it expand into public territory, just held it between themselves like something too precious for open air. At 14 weeks, she had a scan. She and Emeka sat side by side in the clinic, and when the image appeared on the screen, when the heart beat, that small, impossible, furious drumbeat filled the room, Adaeze pressed her mouth to her mouth. The sonographer, a young woman with kind eyes, said, "Strong and clear. Everything looks excellent." Adaeze turned to Emeka. He was crying in the undisguised way of a man who had stopped being afraid to be seen. She put her hand on his face and he pressed his eyes shut, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her palm. She thought of the morning with the positive test in the bathroom of the Enugu flat. She thought of the 14 weeks that ended in silence and cold paper. She thought of the road outside her school in Inewi, the folder under her arm, the motorbike going past. She thought of the yellow table in the small apartment, the window that faced east, the light every morning. She thought, I rebuilt myself from the inside out and what I built held. She thought, some things have to break entirely before you can see what they were actually made of. They remarried, not officially, they were still legally married, but they held a renewal in Inewi the following January, small, family only, at Adaeze's parents' house. Adaeze's father gave the same quiet smile he had given at the first wedding and said nothing because he had already said the important things. Emeka's business recovered slowly. The housing project came back. The Lagos developer called again, said circumstances had changed, and this time Emeka negotiated his own terms rather than simply accepting what was offered. His mother, watching from her chair, said nothing. That too was a kind of change. Obiageli married Kelechi the following year. Mama Nosu attended the wedding in a wheelchair, wearing her best lace, and she laughed twice, a real laugh, unguarded, which her children had not heard in some time. Chinwe finished school and got a job in Lagos and called her mother every Sunday. She was working on her own understanding of the things she had absorbed growing up, the calculations, the suspicions, the fears dressed as protections. She was young enough that the working on was possible. She was trying. Uncle Gidiofor's case was resolved through the courts over the course of 2 years. He was not imprisoned, his lawyer was better than the evidence against him in certain particulars, but he was required to repay the cooperative society, and the repayment consumed most of what he had. He moved in with one of his sons. He was quieter than before. Whether this was remorse or simply reduced circumstances, only he knew. Ifelma, his wife, went to live with her daughter in Port Harcourt. She learned to bake small cakes on the weekends. She sounded, when you spoke to her on the phone, like a woman who had set something very heavy down and could finally feel the lightness in her own hands. And Adaeze. In the second year of their rebuilding, she became pregnant again. She did not tell anyone for the first 12 weeks, not even Emeka. She told him at 8 weeks, and together they did not speak it widely, did not let it expand into public territory, just held it between themselves like something too precious for open air. At 14 weeks, she had a scan. She and Emeka sat side by side in the clinic, and when the image appeared on the screen, when the heart beat, that small, impossible, furious drumbeat filled the room, Adaeze pressed her mouth to her mouth. The sonographer, a young woman with kind eyes, said, "Strong and clear. Everything looks excellent." Adaeze turned to Emeka. He was crying in the undisguised way of a man who had stopped being afraid to be seen. She put her hand on his face and he pressed his eyes shut, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her palm. She thought of the morning with the positive test in the bathroom of the Enugu flat. She thought of the 14 weeks that ended in silence and cold paper. She thought of the road outside her school in Inewi, the folder under her arm, the motorbike going past. She thought of the yellow table in the small apartment, the window that faced east, the light every morning. She thought, I rebuilt myself from the inside out and what I built held. She thought, some things have to break entirely before you can see what they were actually made of. They remarried. Not officially, they were still legally married, but they held a renewal in Inewi the following January. Small, family only, at Adaeze's parents' house. Adaeze's father gave the same quiet smile he had given at the first wedding and said nothing because he had already said the important things. Emeka's business recovered slowly. The housing project came back. The Lagos developer called again, said circumstances had changed, and this time Emeka negotiated his own terms rather than simply accepting what was offered. His mother, watching from her chair, said nothing. That too was a kind of change. Obiageli married Kelechi the following year. Mama Nosu attended the wedding in a wheelchair, wearing her best lace, and she laughed twice, a real laugh, unguarded, which her children had not heard in some time. Chinwe finished school and got a job in Lagos, and called her mother every Sunday. She was working on her own understanding of the things she had absorbed growing up, the calculations, the suspicions, the fears dressed as protections. She was young enough that the working on was possible. She was trying. Uncle Jidiofor's case was resolved through the courts over the course of 2 years. He was not imprisoned. His lawyer was better than the evidence against him in certain particulars, but he was required to repay the cooperative society, and the repayment consumed most of what he had. He moved in with one of his sons. He was quieter than before. Whether this was remorse or simply reduced circumstances, only he knew. Ifeoma, his wife, went to live with her daughter in Port Harcourt. She learned to bake small cakes on the weekends. She sounded, when you spoke to her on the phone, like a woman who had set something very heavy down and could finally feel the lightness in her own hands. And Adaeze. In the second year of their rebuilding, she became pregnant again. She did not tell anyone for the first 12 weeks, not even Emeka. She told him at 8 weeks, and together they did not speak it widely, did not let it expand into public territory, just held it between themselves like something too precious for open air. At 14 weeks, she had a scan. She and Emeka sat side by side in the clinic, and when the image appeared on the screen, when the heart beat, that small, impossible, furious drumbeat filled the room, Adaeze pressed her mouth to her hand. The sonographer, a young woman with kind eyes, said, "Strong and clear. Everything looks excellent." Adaeze turned to Emeka. He was crying in the undisguised way of a man who has stopped being afraid of being seen. She put her hand on his face, and he pressed his eyes shut, and she felt the warmth of his skin against her palm. She thought of the morning with the positive test in the bathroom of the Enugu flat. She thought of the 14 weeks that had ended in silence and cold paper. She thought of the road outside her school in Inewi, the folder under her arm, the motorbike going past. She thought of the yellow table in the small apartment, the window that faced east, the light every morning. She thought, I rebuilt myself from the inside out, and what I built held. She thought, some things have to break entirely before you can see what they were actually made of. Their daughter was born in October, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with Emeka's forehead and Adaeze's eyes, and a cry like someone who had decided from the first breath that she was going to be heard. They named her Chidima. It means God is good. Mama Nuoso held her for a long time. She did not speak much. She traced the baby's fingers with her own, the left hand, the weaker one, with an expression on her face that was beyond naming. Adaeye watched her from across the room. She felt something complex and layered and true. Not simple forgiveness, not the erasure of what had happened, but something that acknowledged the full weight of everything, the grief, the cruelty, the rebuilding, the choice she had made to return not from weakness, but from her own clear, deliberate decision. She had not gone back because she had nowhere to go. She had gone back because she had rebuilt herself fully, and from that wholeness, she had been able to see her husband clearly, his failures and his efforts, and had chosen with open eyes. That is a different thing entirely from what she had done at 26 by the drinks table. That was love discovering itself. This was love choosing itself, and the choosing kind is the kind that holds. There is an old saying in Igbo, a real one, the kind that has survived not because it sounds beautiful, but because it is true. Onye wetara oji, wetara ndu. The one who brings the kola nut brings life. There is a less famous version, the kind that grandmothers say when the storyteller has gone and it is just family left around the fire. Ihe mere oji, ebui ihe mere oji. What happened to the kola nut is not the whole story of the kola nut. What happened to Adaeze was not the whole story of Adaeze. What happened to the Noosu family was not the whole story of the Noosu family. The whole story is still being written, the way all real stories are, not in the dramatic hours, not in the moment of crisis or collapse, but in the ordinary days that come after. In the phone calls and the Sunday meals and the arguments that get resolved and the ones that get set aside. In the walking stick and the weak left arm and the baby's fingers being traced. In the yellow table that still sits in a back room somewhere, painted badly, enduring. We tell these stories not because they are resolved. We tell them because somewhere in the listening, we recognize ourselves, the versions of ourselves that were pushed out before we were ready, the parts of ourselves we had to leave behind in order to come back whole, the moment where we stood at a gate with our hands in our pockets and said the wrong thing or the right thing or nothing at all. And if any part of this story reached something in you, subscribe because there are more stories like this one, stories that don't let you go. Stories where the women rebuild and the families reckon with themselves and the truth comes out not with thunder, but with the slow setting weight of time. Chidima is 3 years old now. She calls her grandmother Mama Ne and reaches up both small arms to be lifted, and Nuosu lifts her with the right arm, the strong one, and holds her against her chest. And sometimes from the kitchen, Adaeze can hear them in the living room, the old woman and the child, having a conversation in 2 different languages that somehow makes perfect sense.